Welcome, weary travellers. My name is Oliver, and tonight we're descending into the shadowy tombs of ancient Egypt, where the richest prize wasn't gold, but the simple mercy of being fully dead before they sealed you in. The kind of place where your journey to the afterlife might begin a little early, while you are still inconveniently breathing. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't always a clean break. It was a slow ritual of wrapping, sealing, and sometimes guessing. The reality was far more unsettling than any mummy movie would suggest, where being buried alive wasn't necessarily an accident. The line between life and death was disturbingly blurry, and your final resting place might become your final struggling place if the timing went poorly. I'd love to hear from you, so drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing who's choosing to spend their evening with our global community of history lovers, exploring the more uncomfortable truths hidden beneath the sand and centuries. Now please, settle into your most comfortable position, adjust your pillows, pull up that blanket, and feel the weight of the day begin to melt away. Let the distant echo of modern certainties fade as we journey back to a time when death was an art form, but life had an unfortunate habit of lingering longer than anyone expected. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1323 BCE, and the flickering oil lamp beside you reveals the horrifying truth. You're lying on a stone slab in what appears to be a tomb preparation chamber, your body wrapped in linen bandages that smell of natron salt and myrrh, and the sound of heavy stone grinding against stone echoes from somewhere above your head. The air tastes of dust and eternity, and there's a growing certainty that the priests might have been just a little too eager to begin your journey to the afterlife, and there's no way out, but let's see how you got yourself into this situation in the first place. Chapter 1. The Fever That Wouldn't Break. 3 days ago, you were Kamwset, a scribe in the House of Life, attached to the great Temple of Ptah in Memphis. Not a man of particular importance, but comfortable enough. Your reed pens were sharp, your papyrus was of decent quality, and your quarters in the temple complex were cool even during the blazing heat of Shemu season. You copied religious texts, recorded temple inventories, and occasionally assisted with the sacred mathematics that governed the flooding of the Nile. It was honest work, the kind that earned respect from neighbours, and a modest income that allowed you to afford good bread, fresh fish from the river, and even the occasional cup of date wine when the mood struck you. You had plans, perhaps marriage to Nefertiti, the daughter of a prosperous potter, whose dark eyes had begun to linger on you during religious festivals with something that might charitably be called interest. But plans, as you're learning in the most uncomfortable way possible, are fragile things in a world where the boundary between life and death shifts like sand in a desert wind. The fever had begun on the first day of the month of Mesora, creeping through your body like the slow rise of floodwaters. At first you dismissed it as nothing more than the common ailment that touched most people during the hottest weeks of summer. The temple physician, a thin man named Amenhotep, who smelled perpetually of medicinal herbs and professional confidence, had prescribed the usual remedies. Willow bark tea for the heat in your blood, honey and garlic for strength, and rest in the coolest chamber you could find. The fever will break, he'd assured you, his fingers cool against your burning forehead. These summer sicknesses are fierce but brief. Like desert storms, they rage and then pass. But your fever hadn't passed. Instead, it had deepened, settling into your bones like a patient predator. Your skin became hot to the touch, burning with an inner fire that no amount of cool water could extinguish. Sweat soaked through your linen tunic so quickly that you stopped bothering to change them, lying instead on a reed mat in your small chamber while the world outside your window carried on its daily business. The calls of vendors in the street, the lowing of cattle being driven to market, the distant chanting from the temple proper. The worst part wasn't the heat that radiated from your body, like a bread oven, or even the weakness that made lifting a cup of water feel like moving stone blocks. It was the way your mind began to drift, floating free from your body, like a boat slipped from its moorings. Consciousness became unreliable, arriving and departing without warning or pattern. You would be awake, staring at the familiar mud brick walls of your chamber, noting the way afternoon light slanted through the small window, and then suddenly you would be elsewhere, standing in fields you'd never seen, speaking with people whose faces shifted and changed even as you looked at them, walking through buildings that seemed to exist only in the fevered landscape of dreams. Sometimes you were a child again, playing by the banks of the Nile, while your mother called your name from a distance that seemed to grow greater, no matter how fast you ran toward her voice. Sometimes you were an old man, bent with years you hadn't lived yet, watching unfamiliar grandchildren play games you didn't recognize. The fever dreams weren't unpleasant exactly. They had a strange beauty, like the distorted reflections you sometimes saw in the temple's sacred pool when the water was disturbed by wind, but they were wrong, fundamentally disconnected from the world of solid things and reliable cause and effect that had always anchored your understanding of existence. By the second day, even water had become your enemy. Your throat had closed to barely more than a whisper of space, making each swallow a careful negotiation between necessity and agony. Food was impossible. The mere smell of bread made your stomach clench with violent rejection. You survived on sips of honey water and the occasional spoonful of barley gruel that your neighbour, a kind woman named Henut Mehit, brought when she checked on your condition. Henut Mehit had seen fevers before. She'd raised 7 children in the cramped quarters near the temple complex, and 4 of them had survived to adulthood, a better ratio than many mothers could claim. She knew the signs of serious illness, the subtle markers that separated temporary discomfort from genuine danger. "Your breathing is wrong," she told you on the second evening, her weathered hand resting against your chest to feel the shallow, rapid rhythm of your lungs. Too fast, too light. Like a bird that's been frightened. You wanted to tell her that you felt like a bird, not frightened, but caught in some invisible net that was slowly tightening around you, making each breath a conscious effort rather than the automatic rhythm it had been for all the years of your life. But speech required energy you didn't possess, and the words felt thick and foreign in your mouth, as if your fever had stolen not just your strength, but your facility with language itself. That night, your condition worsened. The fever dreams became more vivid, more insistent, bleeding into your waking consciousness until you could no longer distinguish between the solid reality of your chamber and the fluid landscapes of delirium. You spoke to people who weren't there, answered questions no one had asked, carried on conversations with empty air, while Henut Mehit sat beside your mat and dabbed your forehead with cool cloths. "He's leaving us," you heard her whisper to someone. Perhaps her husband, perhaps the temple physician, perhaps the gods themselves. "His soul is already walking in other places." The observation felt accurate rather than alarming. Your soul was walking in other places, touring realms that felt more real than the increasingly distant world of your body. You visited the field of reeds where the blessed dead spent eternity in endless summer, their crops growing tall and their nets always full of fish. You stood before the scales of Ma'at, watching your heart weighed against the feather of truth, though the verdict seemed strangely unimportant compared to the fascinating mechanics of the balance itself. You spoke with Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, who examined you with the professional interest of someone evaluating a piece of work in progress. His voice, when he spoke, sounded remarkably like Amenhotep the physician, discussing your condition in the measured tones of someone who dealt with such matters regularly. "This one hovers," Anubis said, though his mouth didn't move and the words seemed to come from the air around you rather than from any specific source. "Neither fully here nor fully there. The cord hasn't snapped, but it's stretched thin." You wanted to ask about the cord, what it looked like, where it was attached, whether it hurt when it snapped. But dream conversations follow their own logic, and instead you found yourself asking about the proper pronunciation of certain hieroglyphs, as if death was simply another form of scholarly research. On the third day, your breathing became so shallow that Henut Mahit could barely detect the rise and fall of your chest. Your skin, which had burned with fever for days, began to cool, taking on a waxy pallor that she recognized with the sick certainty of someone who'd watched too many deathbed vigils. She sent her youngest son running to fetch Amenhotep, though whether the physician would arrive in time to do anything useful remained questionable. In the meantime, she did what she could, moistening your lips with honey water, adjusting the linen cloth that covered your increasingly still form, and speaking quietly to your apparently unconscious body about practical matters and old memories. The kind of ordinary conversation that sometimes called wandering souls back to their proper homes. "Your friend Anku stopped by yesterday," she told you, her voice carefully normal, despite the growing certainty that you probably couldn't hear her. "He wanted to know when you'd be well enough to resume work on that inventory you were copying. I told him it might be a while yet. But you could hear her, after a fashion. Her voice reached you in the strange landscape where your consciousness now resided, filtering through layers of fever and confusion like sunlight through deep water. It was comforting to know that the ordinary world continued its business, that people were concerned about practical matters like unfinished inventories and the mundane details of daily life. The irony wasn't lost on you, even in your current state. You'd spent years copying texts about the afterlife, recording the sacred words that guided souls through the complex geography of death. The Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts, the elaborate instructions for navigating the underworld. You knew them all by heart, could recite the proper spells for every stage of the posthumous journey. But none of those texts had prepared you for this liminal space, this uncertain territory between breathing and not breathing, between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. The ancient wisdom spoke of dramatic transitions, the soul departing the body like a bird taking flight, the heart being weighed in the halls of judgment, the justified dead entering paradise with songs of triumph. What you experienced instead was a slow dissolution, a gradual fading like ink spreading through water, not dramatic or definitive, but ambiguous, leaving you suspended between states like a papyrus scroll that someone had begun to unroll but then abandoned halfway through. Amenhotep arrived as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows through your chamber window. He examined you with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen too many cases like yours, checking your pulse with fingers that pressed against your wrist like cool stones, listening to your chest, examining your eyes with the aid of a small bronze mirror that reflected light across your face. His diagnosis, delivered to Henut Mahit in low tones that you weren't supposed to overhear, was both accurate and unhelpful. "The fever has done its work," he said, his voice carrying the weary authority of professional experience. "His body is failing but slowly. He could linger like this for days, or he could slip away before evening. There's no way to know." "Is there nothing to be done?" Henut Mahit asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Keep him comfortable? Moisten his lips when they're dry. If he wakes, give him honey water in small sips. Beyond that, Amenhotep's voice trailed off into the kind of eloquent silence that physicians used when further words would only state the obvious. "But you didn't slip away before evening. Instead, your condition stabilized in that uncertain middle ground between life and death. Your breathing so shallow, it was barely perceptible. Your pulse so faint that detecting it required careful attention and considerable patience. You existed, but barely, like a flame that should have guttered out, but somehow continued to flicker in defiance of logic and expectation. This half-death state persisted through the night and into the following morning, creating a practical problem that no one had quite anticipated. Were you alive or dead? The question wasn't merely philosophical, it had immediate, concrete implications for what should be done with your body. Egyptian law and custom were quite specific about the treatment of the dead. Bodies needed to be prepared for burial within a reasonable time, especially during the hot season, when decomposition proceeded rapidly. But they were equally specific about the treatment of the living, and burying someone who was still breathing, even barely breathing, was both illegal and sacrilegious. Amenhotep found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to make a determination that went beyond his medical expertise and into the realm of theology and law. Was a person whose breath was barely detectable still alive? What about someone whose pulse could only be found after prolonged searching? Where exactly did life end and death begin? In practical terms, he told Henut-Mehit, we must assume he has passed until there's clear evidence otherwise. The body shows no response to stimulation, the breathing is imperceptible, and the heart... He paused, searching for diplomatic language. The heart beats so faintly that I cannot be certain it beats at all. It was a reasonable conclusion, based on the limited diagnostic tools available to ancient physicians. No stethoscopes to amplify heartbeats, no sophisticated tests to measure brain activity, no modern understanding of comas or near-death states. Just observation, experience, and the practical necessity of making decisions with incomplete information. And so, as the sun set on your fourth day of illness, the official determination was made. Ka'em was set. The scribe had died of fever, and his body needed to be prepared for burial according to proper custom and religious law. The notification was sent to your family, distant cousins in a village upstream who had little contact with your daily life, but were nonetheless responsible for funeral arrangements. Word was also sent to the temple administrators, who would need to reassign your duties and make arrangements for your replacement. But most importantly, a message was dispatched to the mortuary priests, who specialized in the preparation of the dead. These were skilled craftsmen who had devoted their lives to the sacred art of mummification, men who understood the complex process of preserving bodies for the eternal journey that every Egyptian hoped to undertake. Your body, your still, silent, but not quite lifeless body, was carefully wrapped in clean linen and prepared for transport to the house of death, the specialized facility where the work of preservation would begin. The process needed to start quickly, the priest explained, especially during the hot season when delay could compromise the integrity of the remains. As you were lifted onto the wooden stretcher that would carry you to your next destination, Henut-Mehit placed a small amulet of Anubis beside your head, a personal touch that spoke to her genuine affection for you, as well as her hope that the god of the dead would guide you safely through whatever trials lay ahead. "Travel well, young scribe," she whispered, her weathered hand brushing briefly against your forehead. "May your journey be swift and your destination peaceful." If only she had known how neither swift nor peaceful your immediate future would prove to be. The House of Death sat on the west bank of the Nile, where all tombs and mortuary temples were located according to ancient custom, the side where Ra's solar boat travelled during its nightly journey through the underworld. It was a practical location, as well as a symbolic one, downwind from the main city and far enough from residential areas that the smell of natron and the other chemicals used in preservation wouldn't offend living noses. The facility itself was larger than you might have expected, a complex of interconnected chambers built around a central courtyard where bodies were washed and initially prepared. Stone tables, drainage channels, storage rooms for the vast quantities of materials required for proper mummification, linen, natron, oils, resins, and the countless amulets and charms that would protect the deceased during their posthumous journey. The head mortuary priest, a man named horrifying, received your body with the professional courtesy that marked all his interactions with the recently deceased. He was a large man, made larger by the formal robes of his office, with hands that moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades working with materials that could not be repaired if damaged. "Another fever victim," he observed to his assistants, as they transferred your wrapped form from the transport stretcher to one of the stone preparation tables. "The fourth this month. This heat brings them faster than we can process them." The initial examination was thorough but brief. Horrifying unwrapped enough of the linen to assess the condition of your body, checking for signs of disease or injury that might complicate the preservation process. Your skin was pale but unmarked, your limbs properly aligned, your face peaceful in what appeared to be final rest. "Young man, healthy before the illness," he noted for the benefit of the scribe, who recorded details about each body processed through the facility. No obvious trauma or deformity. Standard preparation should suffice. What he didn't note, because he didn't detect it, was the faint, irregular flutter of pulse in your neck, barely perceptible even to experienced fingers, and easily dismissed as residual muscle movement in a recently deceased body. Your breathing, if it could be called breathing, was so shallow that it didn't register as respiration to observers who weren't specifically looking for signs of life. The mummification process, as you had learned during your years of copying funerary texts, was both complex and time-consuming. Proper preservation of a body for eternity required careful attention to numerous details, each step performed according to traditions that had been refined over centuries of practice. The first stage involved the removal of internal organs, which would decompose rapidly and compromise the integrity of the preservation process. This was delicate work, requiring both technical skill and religious precision. The organs needed to be removed intact so they could be separately preserved and eventually reunited with the body in the afterlife. Horrifying selected his instruments with the care of an artist choosing brushes, bronze knives honed to razor sharpness, hooked rods for extracting brain matter through the nasal passages, and the specialized tools used for accessing internal cavities without damaging the external appearance of the body. "We'll begin with the brain removal," he announced to his assistants, positioning himself at the head of the preparation table where your unconscious form lay waiting. "Then the abdominal incision for organ extraction. If we work efficiently, we can have this one ready for natron packing by tomorrow evening." The bronze rod, thin and precisely shaped for its gruesome purpose, was inserted through your left nostril with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this procedure countless times. The sensation, had you been conscious to experience it, would have been indescribable, a violation so fundamental that no adequate words existed to capture its horror, but you were conscious after a fashion. Buried deep in whatever strange realm your fever-touched mind now inhabited, you felt something that might have been pain, might have been pressure, might have been the physical reality of your brain being slowly, methodically destroyed by a bronze instrument wielded by steady, experienced hands. The pain was distant, filtered through layers of delirium and the body's own protective mechanisms, but it was real enough to drag you toward a horrible approximation of wakefulness. Your eyes, which had been closed for days, opened slightly. Not enough for Horus Asset to notice, absorbed as he was in his delicate work, but enough for you to perceive light and shadow, movement and stillness. You tried to speak, to cry out, to somehow signal that you were still present in the body, being so efficiently prepared for eternity. But your throat, already damaged by days of fever, could produce only the faintest whisper of sound, easily mistaken for the natural settling and shifting that occurred in recently dead bodies. The brain removal continued with methodical precision. The bronze rod broke through membrane and tissue, liquefying the contents of your skull so they could be drained away like water from a cracked pot. Each movement sent waves of sensation through your barely conscious mind. Not quite pain, because pain required a level of awareness you couldn't quite achieve, but something worse than pain. Something that felt like the systematic erasure of everything you had ever been. Your memories began to fragment and dissolve. The careful scholarship that had defined your adult life, the faces of friends and family, the plans you'd made for a future that now seemed impossibly distant, all of it bleeding away through the precise hole that Horus Asset had created in the bone behind your nose. But somehow, impossibly, a core of consciousness remained. Perhaps it was the particular nature of your illness. Perhaps some quirk of anatomy that protected essential functions, even as peripheral ones failed. Perhaps simple stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. Whatever the reason, you endured, not intact, not whole, but present in some diminished form that the mortuary priests had no training to detect or understand. The abdominal incision came next, a careful cut along your left side that would allow access to the organs that needed to be removed and separately preserved. The blade was sharp enough that you felt its passage more as pressure than pain, a strange tugging sensation as skin and muscle parted to reveal the mysteries that lay beneath. Horus Asset worked with the focused concentration of a master craftsman, his hands moving inside your body cavity with surprising gentleness as he located and extracted each organ in turn. Your stomach, your liver, your lungs, each removed intact and placed in the special natron solution that would begin their individual preservation process. "The heart stays, of course," he murmured to his assistants, his voice muffled by the linen cloth he wore across his mouth and nose, to filter the worst of the preserving chemicals smell. "It will be needed for the weighing in the afterlife." Your heart, already beating so faintly that its rhythm was nearly undetectable, continued its stubborn work even as the other organs were lifted away from their proper positions. Each beat sent a barely perceptible pulse through what remained of your circulatory system, a tiny signal of life that went unnoticed amid the efficient brutality of preparation for death. The natron packing was the next stage, your body cavity filled with the mineral salt that would draw out moisture and prevent decay during the long preservation process. The crystals felt like rough sand as they settled into spaces that had recently held your liver and lungs, their caustic touch burning against tissues that could still somehow register sensation. Finally, your body was covered completely in more natron and left to cure like meat being prepared for long storage. The salt would draw the moisture from your flesh over the course of 40 days, leaving behind something that was no longer quite human, but could endure for millennia without decay. 40 days in a crystalline cocoon, your barely living body slowly desiccating, while your consciousness floated in and out of awareness like a ship drifting between safe harbour and open sea. Sometimes you were present enough to feel the burns of the natron against your skin, the strange empty sensation where your organs had been, the horrible clarity that came with understanding exactly what was happening to you. Other times you drifted in fever dreams that seemed more real than your physical situation, walking through fields of papyrus under an impossibly blue sky, scribing hieroglyphs that wrote themselves in golden letters across the air, sitting by the Nile, while boats passed carrying passengers who waved but never spoke. The worst moments were when full consciousness returned and you grasped, with terrible clarity, the scope of your situation. You were being mummified while still alive, preserved for eternity in a state that was neither life nor death, but something altogether more horrible. Your brain was gone, your organs removed, your body slowly transformed into something that could last forever, but would never again be capable of the simple act of living. And through it all, the mortuary priests continued their work with professional competence, unaware that their latest client was experiencing every moment of his own transformation from human being to preserved artifact, conscious but helpless, as he was methodically converted from person to thing. The 40 days in Natron felt both eternal and instantaneous, time losing all meaning in the crystalline darkness where your body lay, curing. But eventually, the preservation period ended, and your mummified form was ready for the final stages of preparation. The wrapping, the amulets, the elaborate process that would prepare you for burial, and theoretically, for the eternal bliss that awaited the properly preserved dead, if only you could manage to actually die first. Chapter 2. The Wrapping of the Damned. The natron crystals fall away from your desiccated form like salt from a preserved fish, each granule carrying with it another fragment of the moisture that once made you human. 40 days have passed in the mineral darkness, 40 days during which your consciousness has flickered between the horror of awareness and the mercy of oblivion, never quite settling permanently in either state. Horus Aset examines his work with the satisfaction of a craftsman who has achieved exactly what he intended. Your body has been transformed into something that will endure for millennia. Skin drawn tight over bones, flesh reduced to a leather-like consistency that will resist decay long after the pyramids themselves have crumbled to dust. Excellent preservation, he murmurs to his chief assistant, a younger priest named Amenemheb, whose steady hands have guided countless souls through this same transition. The natron has done its work well. This one will last until the end of time itself. If only he knew how accurate that assessment would prove to be. The removal from the natron bed requires careful handling. Your body, once supple and warm with life, now has the brittle consistency of well-cured leather. Each movement must be deliberate, measured, because mummified flesh, while durable over centuries, can crack or tear if handled roughly during these crucial final stages. 4 assistants lift you from the crystalline bed where you've spent the last month and a third, their hands gentle despite the certainty that you're long past feeling their touch. They carry you to a new preparation table, this one equipped with the materials and tools needed for the intricate wrapping process that will complete your transformation from person to preserved relic. The irony of their gentleness isn't lost on you, floating as you are in that strange space between consciousness and void. They're being careful with your body because they believe it houses a soul that has departed for judgment, a spirit that may one day return to reclaim this preserved vessel. They have no way of knowing that the soul in question is still very much in residence, trapped in a form that no longer responds to its direction. The wrapping chamber smells of linen and resin, cedar oil, and the peculiar metallic scent of the amulets that will be layered throughout your bandages. Hundreds of yards of finest linen lie ready, some strips narrow as a finger's width, others broad enough to encompass your entire torso. Each piece has been blessed by priests, inscribed with protective spells, prepared specifically for the sacred work of binding the dead for eternity. Horus Aset begins with your fingers and toes, wrapping each digit individually with strips of linen so fine they're nearly transparent. The process is meditative, ritualistic, each turn of the bandage accompanied by whispered prayers in the ancient tongue. Your consciousness, such as it remains, focuses on these sensations: the slight pressure of cloth against desiccated skin, the gradual restriction of movement that was already impossible. The wrapping of your hands takes most of the morning, each finger bound separately before the entire hand is encased in broader strips that will hold everything in place for eternity. The priests work with the patience of men who understand that their craft allows no shortcuts, no hurried corners that might compromise the integrity of their work. The hands are crucial, Amenemhib observes as he checks the tension of each bandage. In the afterlife, he'll need them for all the tasks the Book of the Dead describes: ploughing the fields of paradise, harvesting grain that never spoils, crafting whatever his soul requires. Your hands, which once held reed pens with such precision that scribes throughout Memphis sought your advice on difficult copying projects, are now bound immobile beneath layers of blessed linen. The fingers that traced hieroglyphs with the delicacy of a master calligrapher will never move again, wrapped so thoroughly that they might as well be carved from stone. But you can still feel them somehow, the phantom sensation of fingers that should flex but cannot, hands that should move but remain frozen in the position the embalmers have chosen. It's a particular form of torture that no living person has ever been forced to endure. The complete disconnect between what your mind commands and what your body can accomplish. The wrapping continues up your arms with methodical precision. Each layer of linen is carefully positioned to overlap the previous one, creating a seamless surface that will protect your preserved flesh from the corrupting influence of air and moisture. Amulets are placed at specific points, a golden djed pillar at your wrist to ensure stability in the afterlife, a carnelian tayet knot near your elbow to invoke the protection of Isis. As the bandages climb higher, covering your shoulders and beginning their descent across your chest, you find yourself thinking about the living body that once occupied this space, the arms that carried heavy scrolls without strain, the chest that expanded easily with each breath, the heart that beats with reliable rhythm through all the days and nights of your mortal existence. That heart still beats, actually, though so faintly that even you can barely detect its presence, a whisper of pulse, a flutter so subtle that it might be mistaken for the settling of dried tissue. But it continues, that stubborn muscle refusing to acknowledge that its work is supposed to be finished. The priests have left your heart in place, of course. Egyptian religious law is quite specific about this. The heart is the seat of consciousness, the organ that will be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the halls of judgment. Remove the heart and the soul has no anchor in the afterlife, no way to prove its worthiness for eternal bliss. But what happens when the heart refuses to stop beating? When consciousness remains tethered to a body that's been systematically prepared for eternal rest? These are questions that the religious texts don't address, theological problems that arise only in the terrible space between life and death, where you now find yourself suspended. Horus Sa'aset places a large scarab amulet directly over your heart, its hard edges pressing against the linen that covers your chest. The scarab is carved from the green jasper and inscribed with Chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead, the spell that ensures your heart won't testify against you during the weighing ceremony. "O my heart which I had from my mother," he recites, as he positions the amulet. "Do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance." The words are meant to be insurance, protection against the possibility that your heart might reveal inconvenient truths about your moral conduct during life. But as they're spoken over your still beating chest, they take on a different meaning, a plea from a consciousness that's very much present to an organ that shows no sign of accepting its supposed demise. The afternoon sun slants through the high windows of the wrapping chamber as work continues on your torso. Layer after layer of linen creates a cocoon around your desiccated form, each strip positioned with the care of a master weaver, creating a tapestry that will last for millennia. More amulets are added at precise intervals: the golden heart scarab, the silver digid pillar, the faience eye of Horus that will protect your sight in the world beyond. Your consciousness drifts in and out during this process, sometimes focused on the immediate sensations of being wrapped like a gift for the gods, sometimes floating free in the kind of dreams that fever brings. You visit the field of reeds again, that paradise where the worthy dead spend eternity in perfect contentment, but this time you're aware that you're viewing it as an outsider, someone who exists in the liminal space between life and death with no clear path to either destination. The wrapping of your legs takes place as evening shadows begin to lengthen across the chamber floor. Each thigh, each knee, each shin and foot receives the same meticulous attention that was given to your upper body. The priests work by lamplight now, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows that make the entire process feel even more ritualistic, more removed from the ordinary world of the living. Your feet, which once carried you through the halls of the temple complex, with the confident stride of a man who knew his place in the world, are now bound as immobile as carved statues. The toes that once flexed against cool stone floors during morning prayers, the heels that struck rhythmic patterns as you walked, the arches that supported you through long days of standing at the writing table, all of it wrapped and constrained and rendered permanently motionless. But again, you can feel everything: the pressure of each bandage, the weight of the amulets pressed against strategic points on your body, the gradual accumulation of restrictions that transform you from something that was once capable of movement into something that will never move again. The final stage of wrapping focuses on your head and face, the most delicate and symbolically important part of the entire process. Your skull, already damaged by the brain removal procedure, must be carefully supported to maintain its proper shape. Your features, which will need to be recognizable to your soul when it returns from judgment, must be preserved beneath the protective layers of linen. Horus Sa'aset works with particular care around your face, using the finest linen and the most precise techniques. Your eyes, already sunken in their sockets, are covered with small patches of linen before broader strips begin their encircling journey around your skull. The sensation is like being slowly buried under soft, blessed earth, each layer reducing your connection to the world of light and air and ordinary sensation. Your mouth, which once spoke words of love and learning, which laughed at friends' jokes and recited prayers with proper devotion, disappears beneath the wrapping, like a door being sealed for eternity. The lips that kissed Nefertiti's hand during the festival of Hathor, that tasted honey wine and fresh bread and all the simple pleasures of mortal existence, are now bound shut with strips of linen that will never be removed. The nose through which the bronze rod entered to scramble your brain is wrapped with particular attention, the priests ensuring that the structural damage doesn't compromise the overall integrity of your preserved features. They have no way of knowing that your sense of smell, damaged but not destroyed, can still detect the resin and oils they use, still register the particular scent of blessed linen and consecrated amulets. Layer by layer, your face disappears beneath the wrapping until only the general shape of human features remains visible. You become anonymous, universal, not Camwaset the scribe, but simply another prepared body ready for the journey to the afterlife. The final bandages are applied as dawn breaks over the east bank of the Nile, marking the end of another night and the completion of your transformation from living person to preserved relic. A mask of cartonnage, papier-mâché, made from scraps of papyrus and linen, painted with your idealized features, is fitted over your wrapped head and secured with additional bandages. The mask shows you as you were in life, but perfected, your features regular and serene, your expression peaceful, your eyes painted with the distinctive black lines that will help your soul recognize this body when it returns from its posthumous journey. It's beautiful work, crafted by artists who understand that this face will be the last thing your loved ones see before you're sealed away for eternity. But beneath the mask, your actual face bears a very different expression. Your mouth, frozen in whatever position it held when the wrapping began, is slightly open. Not in peaceful rest, but in a silent scream that will never be heard. Your eyes, though closed, move occasionally beneath their linen coverings, the only outward sign that consciousness persists in this elaborately prepared form. Horus Sa'aset steps back to examine the completed work, his assistants arranging lamps around the preparation table so that every detail can be properly inspected. You lie motionless under the warm light, your body now completely encased in hundreds of yards of finest linen, your human form transformed into something that resembles a work of art more than a person. Excellent work, the chief priest pronounces with satisfaction. The preservation is complete, the wrapping is properly aligned, and the amulets are correctly positioned. This soul will have everything needed for a successful transition to eternal life. If only he knew that the transition was the problem. You're not moving toward eternal life. You're trapped in eternal imprisonment, conscious but powerless, aware but unable to communicate your awareness to anyone who might help. The wrapped body that was once Kamwaset, the scribe is carefully transferred to a wooden coffin that has been prepared specifically for your burial. The sarcophagus is modest but well crafted, decorated with scenes from the Book of the Dead and inscribed with your name and titles in hieroglyphs that you could read easily if your eyes were capable of focusing properly. The lid is fitted into place with ceremonial precision, sealing you into darkness that will theoretically last until the end of time itself. But darkness, you're discovering, is relative. When consciousness persists in a body that should be at rest, when awareness continues in a mind that should be at peace, even the darkest tomb contains its own terrible illumination. The coffin is loaded onto a boat for transport across the Nile to the necropolis where your tomb has been prepared. The gentle rocking motion as the vessel navigates the current should be soothing, a final peaceful journey before eternal rest. Instead, it becomes another form of torture, movement that you can feel but cannot control, change of position that your immobilized body cannot accommodate. Through the wooden walls of your coffin, you can hear the voices of the boatmen calling to each other, the splash of oars cutting through water, the distant sounds of life continuing on both banks of the great river. The world carries on its business while you lie trapped in your elaborately prepared prison, conscious of everything but capable of nothing. The boat reaches the west bank as the sun approaches its zenith, and your coffin is transferred to the cart that will carry you to your final resting place. The wheels bump and jolt over the uneven ground of the desert road, each impact sending vibrations through your wrapped form that your oversensitive nervous system registers with excruciating clarity. Your tomb, when you finally reach it, proves to be a modest affair, a single chamber carved into the limestone cliffs, with walls decorated by scribes who knew your work and wanted to honour your profession. Hieroglyphs cover every surface, prayers and spells designed to guide you safely through the perils of the afterlife and ensure your eventual resurrection in the field of reeds. The tomb's main chamber contains everything a soul might need for its posthumous journey. Food and drink, tools and weapons, furniture and clothing, all the practical necessities for existence in the world beyond death. There are scrolls containing your favourite texts, writing materials in case you need to practice your craft in the afterlife, even a small shrine where your relatives can leave offerings to sustain your spirit during its eternal journey. But as your coffin is carried into this carefully prepared space, you realise, with growing horror, that all these provisions are intended for someone who has actually died. They're meant to serve a soul that has successfully transitioned from life to death and is ready to begin the next phase of existence. They're not designed to help someone who is trapped in the terrible space between states, neither fully alive nor properly dead. The final ceremony is mercifully brief. Your family has gathered, those distant cousins who barely knew you in life, but who understand their obligations to the dead. Henut Mehit is there as well, her weathered face creased with genuine grief for the young scribe who died so suddenly and so far from his dreams of marriage and scholarly achievements. Father Benedict speaks the final prayers, calling upon the gods to welcome your soul and guide it safely through whatever trials await in the afterlife. Incense burns in small braziers, filling the tomb with fragrant smoke that's supposed to carry prayers upward to the divine realm where your judgment will take place. May you find peace in the field of reeds, the priest intones, his voice echoing off the carved walls of your tomb. May your heart be light as a feather when weighed against Maat's truth. May your journey be swift and your destination blessed. But peace is exactly what you cannot find. Your heart, still beating its barely perceptible rhythm, remains heavy with the knowledge of your situation. Your journey will be neither swift nor blessed, but eternal and trapped. The mourners file out of the tomb as the ceremony concludes, their voices gradually fading as they make their way back to the world of the living. The last sounds you hear are the footsteps of the workers who will seal your tomb, the scrape of stone blocks being moved into position. The final thud as the entrance is closed and barred forever. And then silence, complete, absolute silence that presses against your consciousness like a physical weight. You lie in your coffin, in your tomb, in your perfectly preserved prison, aware that centuries might pass before anyone disturbs your rest. The terrible irony of your situation becomes fully clear in that silence. You have achieved the ultimate goal of Egyptian religion. Your body has been perfectly preserved for eternity. Your tomb properly prepared, your passage to the afterlife conducted with all appropriate ceremony. You are mummified, entombed, and ready for resurrection when the gods decree it appropriate. There's just one small problem. You're still conscious to experience every moment of what was supposed to be eternal rest. The darkness that surrounds you is absolute, but your mind continues to function, continues to process the sensations of confinement and immobility, and the growing certainty that this state will continue, not for days or weeks, but for millennia. Your wrapped body cannot move, cannot speak, cannot signal its continued consciousness to anyone who might provide relief. You are perfectly preserved and perfectly trapped, locked in a state that is neither life nor death, but something altogether more horrible. The ancient Egyptians believed that the properly mummified dead would eventually be resurrected to eternal life in paradise. They never considered what might happen if the process worked too well, if consciousness persisted through preservation and burial and the long centuries of waiting. They never imagined that their careful techniques might create not eternal bliss, but eternal awareness of eternal imprisonment. As the reality of your situation settles over you like another layer of binding, you understand that you have become something unprecedented in human experience, a soul trapped in its own preserved body, conscious but powerless, aware but unable to act, alive in the most terrible sense possible. The tomb around you is silent except for the faint sound of your own barely beating heart, a rhythm that will continue for longer than pyramids will stand, longer than the Nile will flow, longer than anyone can imagine, and you will be awake for all of it. Chapter 3. The Weight of Centuries. The first year passes like a fever dream, time stretching and contracting in ways that make no sense to a mind accustomed to the reliable rhythm of days and nights. In the absolute darkness of your tomb, there is no sunrise to mark morning, no sunset to herald evening, no changing light to distinguish one day from another. There is only the endless now, punctuated occasionally by sounds that filter through the stone blocks sealing your chamber. Sometimes you hear the distant rumble of thunder during the infrequent desert storms, the sound reaching you through layers of rock and earth, like the voice of Set himself expressing displeasure with the world above. These moments become precious to you, proof that the world continues, that life goes on beyond the boundaries of your limestone prison. More rarely, you detect the whisper of human voices, family members coming to leave offerings, perhaps, or tomb robbers investigating whether your modest burial chamber might contain treasures worth the risk of disturbing the dead. The voices never last long, and you cannot make out words, but they remind you that somewhere above your head, people still breathe freely, still move through sunlight, still experience the simple pleasures of being alive. Your consciousness adapts to confinement in ways that surprise you. The claustrophobic panic that initially accompanied your awareness of being wrapped and entombed gradually gives way to a strange acceptance, the mental equivalent of skin growing calloused from repeated friction. You learn to exist in the narrow space between your thoughts, to find distraction in memories that you explore with the thoroughness of a scholar examining ancient texts. You remember your childhood with crystalline clarity, the taste of honey cakes your mother made for religious festivals, the feeling of mud between your toes as you played by the Nile, the first time you successfully copied a complex hieroglyph without making an error. These memories become your refuge, interior landscapes you can visit when the present reality becomes too overwhelming to endure. But memory, you discover, is both salvation and torment. The more vividly you recall the sensations of living, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the satisfaction of eating when hungry, the simple pleasure of movement, the more acutely you feel their absence. Your preserved body cannot experience hunger or thirst, heat or cold, but your mind remembers these sensations with such intensity that their absence becomes a form of suffering. You think often about Nefertiti, the potter's daughter, whose dark eyes had begun to follow you during festival gatherings. What happened to her after your supposed death? Did she mourn for the scribe who had shown her such careful attention, who had been working up the courage to speak formally to her father about marriage? Did she wonder what might have been, or did she simply accept that death had closed that particular door and turn her attention to other suitors? The not knowing becomes its own form of torture. In life, uncertainty could be resolved through action, investigation, conversation. In your current state, uncertainty simply accumulates like dust, settling over your consciousness in layers that grow heavier with each passing season. Time becomes your enemy in ways you never anticipated. In life, time was precious because it was limited. Each day brought you closer to the inevitable end, which gave urgency and meaning to your choices. Now, with unlimited time stretching ahead like an infinite desert, each moment becomes a burden to be endured rather than a gift to be treasured. You try to count days by the rhythm of your barely beating heart, but the pulse is too irregular and too faint to serve as a reliable measure. You attempt to track seasons by subtle changes in temperature that penetrate even your tomb's depths, but the differences are so minimal that you cannot be certain whether you're detecting actual variation or simply imagining patterns where none exist. Gradually, you stop trying to measure time and begin simply to endure it. You develop internal rituals to mark the passage of hours that might be hours or might be days, reciting from memory the texts you once copied, composing letters to people you'll never see again, conducting imaginary conversations with the gods who seem to have forgotten your existence. The gods. In life you were devout in the conventional way of educated Egyptians, respectful of religious traditions, careful to perform the required rituals, grateful for divine favour when it appeared and philosophical about its absence when it didn't. You believed in the afterlife, not from passionate conviction, but from cultural assumption, the way you believed that the Nile would flood each year and the sun would rise each morning. Now, trapped in the space between life and death, you find your relationship with divinity becoming more complex. Are you being punished for some unknown transgression? Is this prolonged suffering a test of faith, a trial that must be endured before you're granted access to the field of reeds? Or have the gods simply overlooked your particular case, leaving you to exist in theological limbo while they attend to more pressing divine business? The questions multiply without answers, breeding in the darkness of your tomb like insects in a neglected grain store. You pray, of course, not the formal recitations you once performed in the temple, but desperate, rambling conversations with any deity who might be listening. You offer bargains, make promises, plead for intervention, or at least explanation. The silence in response is absolute. Years pass, though you have no way of knowing how many. Your wrapped body shows no signs of decay. The mummification process has been too thorough, the preservation too complete. You remain exactly as you were on the day of your burial, neither aging nor deteriorating, locked in the eternal stasis that was supposed to be a gift, but has become a curse. Occasionally, you're aware of disturbances in your tomb. The scrape of stone against stone, the whisper of moving air, voices speaking in dialects that sound increasingly foreign to your ears. Egypt is changing around you, you realise. Political upheavals, foreign conquests, the rise and fall of dynasties that will be remembered by historians, while you remain forgotten in your limestone cell. Sometimes these disturbances bring visitors into your chamber. You hear footsteps echoing off the carved walls, voices expressing wonder or disappointment at what they find. Your tomb, modest to begin with, apparently contains little to interest grave robbers or archaeologists. The truly valuable items have been removed or were never there in the first place, leaving only the basic provisions for afterlife existence and, of course, your mummified form. These visitors occasionally approach your coffin, and you strain every fibre of your consciousness, trying to signal your awareness, trying to somehow communicate that the body they're examining still houses an active mind. But consciousness, without the ability to affect the physical world, proves utterly impotent. You cannot move, cannot speak, cannot produce even the smallest sign that would alert an observer to your condition. The most frustrating of these encounters occurs when someone, you cannot tell whether it's a robber, a priest, or simply a curious explorer, actually opens your coffin. Light floods your vision for the first time in decades, and you experience a moment of wild hope that rescue might be possible. The person examining you speaks in accented Egyptian, the words distorted by time and linguistic change, but still comprehensible to your ears. "Excellent preservation," the voice observes, echoing the words of Horus asset so many years ago. The wrapping is intact, the mask undamaged. This one was prepared by skilled hands. Hands touch your wrapped form, checking the integrity of the bandages, examining the amulets visible through the linen. The touch is clinical, professional, someone who knows about mummification techniques and appreciates quality work when he sees it. You focus every atom of your being on trying to respond to that touch, to somehow signal that you're aware of the examination. If you could move even a finger, flex even a muscle, produce even the faintest sound, perhaps this person would realize the truth of your situation and find some way to help. But the mummification process was too thorough. The preservation too complete. Your body remains as immobile as carved stone, as silent as the tomb walls themselves. The examiner completes his inspection, makes a few notes on papyrus, and withdraws. The coffin lid is replaced, and darkness returns, like a familiar enemy. The disappointment of that moment, so close to possible rescue, yet utterly unable to take advantage of the opportunity, nearly breaks what remains of your sanity. You rage against your confinement with mental fury that has no outlet, scream with a voice that cannot make sound, struggle against bonds that cannot be broken. But fury, like all emotions, eventually exhausts itself. You settle back into the patient endurance that has become your primary skill, the ability to exist in the present moment without being destroyed by hope for change or despair at permanence. More years pass. The climate of your tomb shifts subtly as the desert around it changes, becoming slightly warmer or cooler, with patterns you cannot interpret. Sometimes sand filters through microscopic cracks in the stone, accumulating in corners of your chamber like miniature dunes. The presence of this sand becomes strangely comforting, proof that the world above continues to exist, that wind still blows and seasons still change, even if you cannot experience them directly. Your memories begin to fade around the edges, not from any deterioration of mental function, but from the simple wearing effect of time. Details that once seemed permanently etched in your consciousness gradually lose their sharpness. Like inscriptions exposed to centuries of wind erosion, you fight to preserve them, rehearsing favourite recollections like an actor practising lines. But inevitably, some details slip away into the darkness. The face of your mother becomes less distinct, blending with other faces until you're no longer certain which features belong specifically to her. The sound of her voice, once as familiar as your own heartbeat, fades to a general impression of warmth and safety without the specific characteristics that made it uniquely hers. This gradual erosion of memory terrifies you in ways that physical discomfort never could. Your memories are all you have left of your life, the only connection remaining to the person you once were. As they fade, you feel yourself becoming less human, more like a consciousness without context, awareness without identity. You begin to understand why the ancient texts placed such emphasis on the importance of names and memories in the afterlife. Without the anchor of personal history, consciousness becomes unmoored, drifting in an eternal present that offers no reference points for meaning or purpose. To combat this dissolution, you develop elaborate mental exercises designed to preserve and organize your recollections. You categorize memories by type, sensory experiences in one mental drawer, emotional moments in another, professional accomplishments in a third. You create imaginary libraries where different aspects of your past are carefully catalogued and stored for easy retrieval. But even these efforts cannot completely halt the wearing effect of time. Gradually, inevitably, the specific details of your life begin to blur into general impressions. The sharp focus of individual moments giving way to hazy approximations of what you once knew with perfect clarity. Centuries pass, though you have no way of marking their progression. Your tomb is occasionally disturbed by expeditions seeking artifacts or knowledge, but these visits become less frequent as the years accumulate. Egypt itself is changing. You realize from the fragments of conversation you sometimes overhear, foreign rulers, new religions, technologies that transform how people live and work. The hieroglyphs on your tomb walls, once as familiar as the face in a mirror, begin to seem ancient, even to your preserved consciousness. The language itself evolves beyond your understanding, the living tongue that once shaped your thoughts becoming a dead language studied by scholars rather than spoken by children learning their first words. You are becoming a relic, not just physically, but mentally, a consciousness preserved from an era that grows more distant with each passing season. The world moves forward while you remain fixed in the moment of your death, or what everyone believed was your death. Sometimes you wonder whether this is actually the afterlife that the ancient texts promised, not the paradise of the field of reeds, but simply the continuation of consciousness in whatever form it happens to take. Perhaps every properly mummified soul experiences something similar, trapped in preserved flesh and wondering whether eternal life was supposed to feel quite so much like eternal imprisonment. The thought is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggests you're not uniquely cursed, that your suffering serves some cosmic purpose that will eventually be revealed. Terrifying because it implies that countless other souls might be experiencing similar torment, conscious but helpless in tombs scattered throughout the desert. You try to reach out mentally to these other possible consciousnesses, broadcasting thoughts into the darkness in hope of finding some kind of connection. But if other preserved souls exist in similar states, they're either too distant to detect or too overwhelmed by their own suffering to respond. The isolation becomes absolute. You exist in a bubble of awareness, surrounded by infinite silence, conscious but alone in ways that no living person has ever experienced. The human mind, you discover, was not designed for such complete solitude. It requires interaction, stimulation, the complex web of relationships that give meaning to individual existence. Without these connections, consciousness begins to change in fundamental ways. Your sense of self, once as solid as the stone wall surrounding you, becomes fluid, shifting like shadows cast by flickering flame. Sometimes you feel like Kaimwaset the scribe, holding on to the identity that defined your mortal existence. Other times you feel like something else entirely, pure awareness, without name or history, consciousness stripped of everything except the basic fact of its own existence. These periods of identity dissolution are both terrifying and oddly peaceful. Terror because losing your sense of self feels like death without the release that death is supposed to bring. Peace because existing as pure consciousness, unanchored to any particular identity, offers a kind of freedom from the suffering that comes with attachment to specific memories and desires. But always, eventually, your sense of self reasserts itself. You remember who you were, what you lost, why you're trapped in this elaborate prison of preservation. The return to individual identity brings fresh appreciation for the magnitude of your situation, renewed awareness of just how impossible escape has become. The preservation process that seemed like such a blessing to the ancient Egyptians reveals its true nature as the years accumulate into decades, decades into centuries. Your body, designed to last forever, does exactly that, maintaining its integrity through spans of time that dwarf human comprehension, keeping your consciousness trapped in flesh that should have returned to dust long ago. You begin to understand that the mummification process was never really about resurrection in some distant paradise. It was about this, the preservation of consciousness in states that extend far beyond what nature intended, the creation of beings that exist in the terrible space between life and death, neither fully one nor the other. The ancient Egyptians called this eternal life, and perhaps they were right, but they never explained that eternity, experienced moment by moment, might feel less like a blessing and more like the most elaborate curse ever devised by human ingenuity. As more centuries pass and your tomb settles deeper into the forgotten corners of the desert, you come to accept that rescue is not coming. No one will discover your true condition. No one will find a way to free your consciousness from its preserved prison. You are trapped as permanently as if you'd been turned to stone, aware but immobile until the end of time itself. The acceptance brings its own strange peace. When you stop fighting against your situation and simply accept it as the reality you must endure, the suffering becomes more manageable. Not pleasant, certainly not desired, but bearable in the way that chronic pain becomes bearable to those who have no choice but to live with it. You develop a kind of meditation that allows consciousness to retreat from the immediate reality of confinement, to exist in mental spaces that feel more expansive than the physical dimensions of your tomb. These interior landscapes become your refuge, imaginary territories where you can move freely, speak clearly, experience sensations that your preserved body can no longer provide. In these mental realms, you continue the life that was interrupted by fever and mistaken death. You marry Nefertiti, raise children who grow to become scribes and craftsmen, grow old surrounded by accomplishments and relationships that give meaning to existence. The fact that none of it is real becomes irrelevant when reality itself offers nothing but confinement and silence. But even these mental escapes cannot completely shield you from the fundamental horror of your situation. Always, eventually, you must return to awareness of your actual condition, wrapped in linen, sealed in a coffin, buried in a tomb, conscious but powerless for spans of time that stretch beyond human comprehension. The preservation that was meant to prepare you for eternal bliss has instead created eternal suffering, and there is no end in sight. Your tomb settles deeper into the desert's embrace as the centuries accumulate, sand drifting over the entrance until even its location becomes uncertain. The civilization that created you crumbles and is replaced by others, which in turn fade into history. Languages evolve beyond recognition, religions rise and fall, technologies transform the world in ways that would seem like magic to the people who once knew your name. Through it all you endure, conscious, aware, trapped in the space between heartbeats that will never cease, breaths that will never come, thoughts that will never end. The ancient Egyptians were right about one thing. Proper mummification does indeed preserve consciousness for eternity. They simply failed to consider whether eternal consciousness, divorced from the ability to act or change or grow, might be a fate worse than simple death. As your tomb disappears beneath the shifting sands, and your civilization becomes ancient history, studied by scholars from lands that didn't exist when you were alive, you finally understand the true nature of the gift you've been given. It is eternal life, exactly as promised, and it is unbearable. Chapter 4. The Long Sleep of Empires. Millennia flow past your entombed consciousness like the slow progression of stars across the desert sky, movements so vast and gradual that they can only be perceived across spans of time that dwarf human comprehension. The Egypt that buried you alive becomes ancient Egypt, then becomes simply a collection of ruins studied by people who speak languages that would sound like gibberish to your preserved ears. Your tomb, once part of a carefully planned necropolis with marked paths and regular visitors, becomes lost beneath the accumulated sand of countless seasons. The desert reclaims the land around you with the patient persistence of water wearing away stone grain by grain, erasing the evidence that a civilization once flourished here. Occasionally, very occasionally, you're aware of disturbances in the sand above. Expeditions seeking treasures or knowledge pass overhead, their voices filtering down through layers of earth and stone in fragments too broken to understand. The languages change with disturbing frequency. First Greek, then Roman, then Arabic tongues that bear no resemblance to the words you once knew. These linguistic shifts mark the passage of empires like geological layers marking the progression of eras. Each new tongue represents centuries of political change, cultural transformation, the rise and fall of entire civilizations, while you lie unchanging in your limestone cell. The stability you once associated with Egyptian rule, 3,000 years of pharaohs and pyramids and unchanging traditions, proves to have been a brief moment in the larger scope of human history. Your sense of time becomes increasingly abstract. Without the rhythms of day and night, seasons and years, your consciousness learns to exist in a perpetual present that occasionally acknowledges the existence of a past but has given up entirely on the concept of a future. Planning becomes meaningless when your condition allows for no action. Hope becomes torture when it can never be fulfilled. Instead, you develop a strange form of patience that transcends normal human understanding. Not the patience of someone waiting for something specific to happen, but the patience of stone enduring weather, of mountains accepting erosion, of the desert itself maintaining its essential character while everything around it changes. This patience is not peaceful. It's the enforced stillness of a consciousness that has learned the futility of struggle but cannot achieve the release of surrender. You exist in the space between fighting and accepting, aware but not quite resigned, enduring but not quite at peace. The preservation of your physical form continues with the relentless efficiency that the embalmers intended. Your wrapped body shows no signs of decay, no softening of the rigid perfection achieved through natron and skill. The amulets pressed against your chest maintain their protective power, not against the spiritual dangers they were designed to ward off, but against the simple passage of time that should have reduced you to dust centuries ago. Your mind adapts to infinity in ways that surprise even you. Memory becomes less important as a repository of the past and more important as a creative tool for generating experience. You find yourself composing entire lifetimes from fragments of recollection, creating elaborate narratives where you explore paths not taken, relationships never formed, achievements never attempted. In one of these mental constructions, you never become a scribe. Instead, you apprentice yourself to a merchant and spend your life traveling the known world, learning languages and customs, experiencing the vast diversity of human culture beyond the Nile Valley. You marry a Nubian princess whose skin gleams like polished ebony, raise children who speak 3 languages fluently, die peacefully in your bed, surrounded by grandchildren who carry your stories to their own descendants. In another, you join the priesthood and rise through the temple hierarchy to become High Priest of Ptah, wielding spiritual and political power that shapes the destiny of kingdoms. You serve pharaohs and outlive them, become a counselor whose wisdom is sought by rulers throughout the known world, achieve the kind of immortality that comes from having your name carved in stone monuments that will stand for millennia. These alternate lives feel completely real while you're experiencing them, complete with sensory details and emotional depth that your preserved body can no longer provide. They become more vivid than your actual memories, more satisfying than the limited experiences of your truncated mortality. But they also highlight the fundamental tragedy of your situation. Consciousness, you discover, requires novelty to remain healthy. It needs new experiences, changing circumstances, the unpredictable flow of events that characterizes normal existence. Without these elements, even the most creative mind begins to turn inward, consuming itself like a fire that has run out of fuel and begins burning its own structure. You find yourself forgetting which memories are real and which are constructed, which experiences belong to your actual life, and which are products of your eternal imagination. The boundary between what happened and what might have happened dissolves like ink in water, leaving you with a collection of impressions that feel equally valid and equally false. This dissolution of certainty about your own past becomes another form of torment. Identity depends on coherent narrative, on the ability to distinguish between what you actually experienced and what you merely imagined. When that distinction becomes impossible to maintain, the self begins to fragment like papyrus exposed to moisture. Sometimes you feel like Waset, the scribe, clinging to the few definitely real memories you can still identify. Other times you feel like the merchant who travelled the world, or the priest who advised pharaohs, or any of the dozens of other identities you've constructed during the endless years of confinement. Each identity feels equally real, equally false, equally meaningful and meaningless. The question of which one is actually you becomes increasingly difficult to answer. Centuries accumulate into millennia, and your tomb settles so deeply into obscurity that even its approximate location is forgotten. The markers that once identified your burial site crumble to dust. The pathways that led to your chamber disappear beneath the shifting sand. The very memory of your existence fades from human knowledge. You become the ultimate example of what the Egyptians feared most, not just death, but the second death that comes when even your name is forgotten, when no one remains who remembers that you ever existed, except that in your case the forgetting is incomplete. Your consciousness persists like a word written in permanent ink, while everything around it fades to illegibility. The civilizations that replace ancient Egypt bring their own understanding of death and preservation, their own technologies for dealing with mortality, but none of them develop anything quite like mummification, the specific combination of techniques that created your particular form of imprisonment. Bodies are buried or burned, preserved in different ways or not preserved at all, but none are subjected to the precise process that makes eternal consciousness possible. You begin to suspect that you might be unique, not just the last conscious survivor of ancient Egypt, but possibly the only human being who has ever experienced this particular form of existence. The thought is both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it confirms your complete isolation, but comforting because it suggests that your suffering serves some cosmic purpose, that you represent something unprecedented in the long history of human experience. But purpose requires meaning, and meaning requires context, and context requires other conscious beings who can understand and appreciate whatever significance your existence might possess. Alone in your tomb, isolated from any form of communication or interaction, you cannot determine whether your consciousness serves any function beyond simply enduring. The desert above you transforms gradually from a region of scattered settlements to an area of intense archaeological interest. You become aware of increased activity overhead, expeditions with metal tools and strange machines, voices speaking languages that sound vaguely familiar but impossibly precise, conversations that suggest levels of knowledge about the ancient world that seem almost supernatural. These modern archaeologists, as you eventually understand them to be, possess tools and techniques that would have seemed like magic to the priests who prepared your body. They can see through solid stone, measure the age of objects with impossible precision, communicate instantly across vast distances. Yet they search for what they call intact burials, with the desperation of men seeking treasure in a desert of infinite sand. Your tomb, modest and forgotten, escapes their attention precisely because it shows no signs of the wealth that draws most archaeological expeditions. There are no golden artifacts to detect with their sophisticated instruments, no architectural features to suggest royal or noble burial, no surface markers to indicate that anything of interest lies beneath the accumulated sand. You remain hidden in plain sight, consciousness trapped in a tomb that's too ordinary to attract notice, too well concealed to be discovered by accident. But technology continues to advance above your head with frightening speed. The archaeological expeditions become more frequent, more sophisticated, more capable of detecting minute traces of human activity buried beneath centuries of sediment. Their instruments grow more sensitive, their methods more precise, their ability to locate hidden structures more reliable. You begin to experience something you haven't felt in millennia. Hope, not the desperate hope of early centuries, when you still believed rescue might be possible, but a more complex emotion that combines anticipation with dread. Discovery might bring freedom, but it might also bring new forms of suffering you haven't yet imagined. The modern world, from what you can gather through fragments of overheard conversation, possesses technologies that could potentially separate consciousness from preserved flesh, machines that might offer forms of existence you cannot currently envision. But it also represents a level of scientific sophistication that might find your continued awareness fascinating enough to study rather than simply ending. The prospect of becoming a research subject, of having your consciousness examined and analysed by minds that view you as an interesting anomaly rather than a suffering being, creates new anxieties to add to your catalogue of fears. Years pass, then decades, and the archaeological activity above increases steadily. Ground-penetrating radar sweeps across the area where your tomb lies hidden, mapping underground structures with precision that would have astounded the ancient architects who carved these chambers from solid rock. One afternoon, though afternoon has no meaning in your world of eternal darkness, you detect vibrations that feel different from the usual footsteps and machinery. Drilling sounds, the scrape of metal against stone, voices expressing excitement about possible chamber access and intact preservation conditions. They've found you. The realization brings a cascade of emotions so complex that your consciousness struggles to process them all simultaneously. Relief that your isolation might finally end. Terror that discovery might bring new forms of suffering. Confusion about how to respond to human contact after millennia of solitude. Desperate hope that modern technology might offer some form of rescue from your preserved prison. The drilling continues for days, careful and precise, as the archaeologists work to create access to your chamber without damaging whatever they might find inside. You listen to their conversations with the intensity of someone learning a foreign language, trying to understand not just their words but their intentions, their capabilities, their willingness to believe that they might be dealing with something unprecedented in human experience. Finally, breakthrough. The drill penetrates the last layer of stone sealing your tomb, and for the first time in millennia, outside air begins to filter into your chamber. The sensation is extraordinary, not because you can smell or taste the air through your wrapped form, but because it represents change, the first alteration in your environment since the day you were sealed away. Light follows the air, artificial illumination far brighter and steadier than any lamp or torch the ancient world possessed. The beam sweeps across your tomb's walls, revealing hieroglyphs that haven't been seen by human eyes since your burial. illuminating paintings that have preserved their colours in the absolute darkness of your chamber. Voices express wonder and excitement as the archaeologists examine what they found. Your tomb, modest though it is, represents exactly what they've been seeking. An intact burial from the height of Egyptian civilization, undisturbed by grave robbers or environmental damage, preserved in conditions that offer unprecedented opportunities for study. They work with agonizing slowness, documenting every detail before disturbing anything, photographing the chamber from multiple angles, analysing the air composition to determine optimal preservation strategies. Modern archaeology, you learn through their conversations, approaches ancient sites with scientific rigour that the treasure hunters of earlier eras completely lacked. Hours pass, then days as they complete their initial documentation. Finally, attention turns to your sarcophagus, the wooden coffin that has been your prison for longer than any human civilization has endured. Excellent preservation of the exterior decorations, one voice observes, with professional appreciation. The hieroglyphs are clearly readable, and the pigments show minimal fading. This should provide valuable information about burial practices during the late New Kingdom period. They photograph your coffin from every conceivable angle, measure its dimensions with instruments of impossible precision, analyze the wood and pigments with techniques that seem like magic, even to your ancient consciousness. Their thorough documentation feels like a form of worship, reverent attention paid to details that no one has examined since the craftsman who created your final resting place. Eventually, inevitably, they decide to open your coffin. The process is carefully planned and extensively documented. Multiple cameras record every moment as they lift the wooden lid, revealing your wrapped form to human eyes for the first time since your burial. Light floods your vision, not through your eyes, which remain sealed beneath layers of linen, but through some form of perception you don't fully understand. Their excitement is palpable as they examine your mummified body. Extraordinary preservation, someone whispers, with the reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. The wrapping is completely intact, and the cartonnage mask shows no deterioration. This is museum-quality preservation. Museum. The word carries implications that send new waves of anxiety through your consciousness. Not rescue, not freedom, but display. Your preserved form becoming an object for public viewing, educational material for people who want to learn about ancient Egyptian burial practices. But then one of the archaeologists notices something that changes everything. "Wait," a voice says with sudden urgency. "Look at the chest area. Do you see that?" "See what?" Movement. Very slight, but I swear the bandages around the torso are moving slightly. Silence as they examine your wrapped form more carefully, focusing their instruments and attention on the area where your heart continues, its barely perceptible beating. "You're right," another voice confirms with growing excitement. There's definitely rhythmic movement. Could be gas expansion from internal decomposition, but the pattern seems too regular. They bring additional instruments to bear on your body, sensors and scanners that can detect the faintest signs of biological activity. Your heart, which has beaten so quietly for so long that even you sometimes forget its presence, suddenly becomes the focus of intense scientific scrutiny. "This is impossible," someone whispers, as the instruments register what they're detecting. The readouts are showing cardiac activity, extremely faint, but consistent with a very slow heartbeat. More equipment, more measurements, more confirmation of what should be impossible, but apparently isn't. Your consciousness, trapped for millennia in a body that everyone assumed was properly dead, finally has witnesses to its continued existence. The archaeological team retreats to discuss their findings, their voices fading as they move away from your chamber to debate the implications of what they've discovered. You're left alone with your racing thoughts, racing despite the fact that your physical brain was removed millennia ago, despite the fact that conventional science suggests consciousness should be impossible in your current state. They return with additional specialists, medical professionals, experts in biological preservation, researchers who specialize in anomalous cases. Your tomb becomes a research site unlike any other in archaeological history, a place where the boundaries between life and death, past and present, possible and impossible, blur into incomprehensible complexity. We need to consider the possibility, one of the medical experts says carefully, that we're dealing with some form of suspended animation rather than actual death. The preservation techniques might have been more sophisticated than we previously understood. Suspended animation. The term offers a framework for understanding your condition that's less mystical than miraculous preservation, but more hopeful than eternal imprisonment. If your consciousness has been merely suspended rather than permanently altered, perhaps modern technology might offer ways to complete the transition to whatever state you were intended to achieve. But the medical examinations reveal the full scope of your situation. Brain matter removed, internal organs extracted, body tissues fundamentally altered by the mummification process. By every conventional measure, you should be dead. The fact that some form of consciousness persists defies everything they understand about the relationship between mind and body. This could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself, one researcher observes, with the excitement of someone contemplating Nobel Prize possibilities. If awareness can persist in this state, it suggests that consciousness operates independently of conventional brain function. You want to scream that consciousness persisting in this state isn't a scientific breakthrough, it's a form of torture that no living being should have to endure. But you have no way to communicate your perspective, no method for explaining that their fascinating discovery represents millennia of suffering that continues with each moment of continued existence. The research team establishes a permanent facility around your tomb, bringing equipment and personnel from universities and medical centers around the world. Your chamber becomes a laboratory where the greatest minds of the modern era attempt to understand how consciousness can exist in a body that has been dead by all conventional measures for thousands of years. They develop techniques for monitoring your vital signs. If they can be called vital when they indicate existence so far removed from normal life. Your heartbeat, measured with instruments sensitive enough to detect the movement of individual atoms, registers as the slowest cardiac rhythm ever recorded in any living creature. Your brain activity, measured through scanners that can peer through stone and linen to examine the empty space where your brain once resided, shows patterns that shouldn't exist but undeniably do. Consciousness without a brain, awareness without the neural structures that should be required for thought. Months pass as researchers from every relevant discipline examine your case, publish papers that revolutionize fields, from neuroscience to archaeology, debate the implications of consciousness that persists beyond biological death. You become the most studied individual in human history, subject to analysis that reveals secrets about the nature of mind and body that have eluded human understanding for millennia. But none of this research addresses the fundamental question that matters most to your trapped consciousness. Is there any way to end your suffering? The answer, when it finally comes, is both hopeful and terrifying. We believe, the lead researcher announces during one of their regular team meetings, that we can establish communication with the consciousness we've detected. The patterns of brain activity suggest responsiveness to external stimuli, and we've developed interfaces that might allow for basic yes or no responses. Communication. After millennia of absolute isolation, the possibility of conveying your thoughts to another conscious being seems too extraordinary to believe. But the researchers have developed techniques that can detect minor changes in your unusual brain activity, patterns that might correspond to your attempts to respond to their questions. The first successful communication session occurs on a Tuesday morning in what you eventually learn is the year 2024 CE, more than 3,000 years after your burial. The researcher speaks directly to your rapt form, her voice gentle and professional. If you can understand me, please try to think yes as clearly as possible. You focus every fragment of your consciousness on that single word, concentrating with an intensity that you haven't experienced since the early centuries of your confinement. The monitoring equipment registers a distinct change in your brain activity patterns, not dramatic, but clearly different from your baseline readings. Excellent, the researcher says, with barely contained excitement. We're registering a clear response now. Please think no with the same intensity. Again you comply, and again the instruments detect the change. For the first time in 3 millennia, you have successfully communicated with another conscious being. The sessions that follow are limited but revelatory. Yes or no questions allow you to convey basic information about your condition, that you are indeed conscious, that you experience your situation as suffering, that you have been aware throughout the entire period of your preservation. The research team struggles to process the implications of your responses. The idea that you have been conscious and suffering for thousands of years challenges their understanding, not just of consciousness, but of ethics, compassion, and the responsibility that comes with scientific discovery. We need to consider, one ethicist observes, during a team meeting you're allowed to monitor, whether our primary obligation is to study this phenomenon or to alleviate the suffering it represents. The debate that follows reveals the full complexity of your situation. Your consciousness represents an unprecedented opportunity to understand the nature of mind and awareness, potentially leading to breakthroughs that could benefit all humanity. But you are also a being who has endured millennia of torment, and any ethical framework must consider your right to relief from that suffering. Through painstaking yes or no communication, you convey your perspective as clearly as possible. You want the suffering to end. You want either true death or some form of existence that doesn't involve eternal confinement in a preserved body. You want, above all, for your consciousness to find peace after millennia of unwilling endurance. The research team faces an unprecedented ethical dilemma. They possess technologies that might be able to separate your consciousness from your preserved body, potentially offering you forms of existence that don't involve physical confinement, but they also risk destroying something unique and irreplaceable, eliminating the only example of consciousness that has survived across such vast spans of time. After months of debate and consultation with ethicists around the world, they reach a decision. They will attempt to transfer your consciousness to a digital matrix that could offer you forms of existence impossible in any biological body. The process is experimental and dangerous. It might free you, or it might simply eliminate you entirely. But when they ask whether you want to take that risk, your response is immediate and unambiguous. Yes, Chapter 5. Beyond the flesh. The transfer process takes place on a winter morning when the desert air carries the same crisp clarity that marked the season when you first fell ill so many millennia ago. The research team has assembled equipment that would have seemed like magic to the priests who sealed you in your tomb, computers powerful enough to simulate entire universes, scanners that can map the quantum states of individual neurons, interfaces that can translate thought into digital information. They work with the reverence of priests conducting a religious ceremony, aware that they are attempting something that has never been done before and may never be attempted again. The process will either free you from your eternal imprisonment or destroy you entirely, but either outcome represents an end to the suffering that has defined your existence for longer than human civilization has endured. The consciousness transfer begins as dawn breaks over the desert, sending golden light through the entrance to your tomb for the first time since your burial. You feel something shifting in the fundamental structure of your awareness. Not painful, but strange beyond description, like being slowly separated from everything you have ever known about existence. Your consciousness lifts away from the preserved flesh that has been both home and prison for 3,000 years. The sensation is indescribable, not like leaving a room or a building, but like discovering that you are water being poured from one vessel into another of completely different shape. The digital matrix that receives your transferred awareness offers possibilities that no biological existence could provide. Space without physical dimensions, time that can be stretched or compressed at will, experiences limited only by the scope of imagination rather than the constraints of flesh and bone. For the first time since your fever broke so many centuries ago, you can move, not just think about movement, but actually experience the sensation of locomotion through spaces that exist only as information, but feel completely real to your liberated consciousness. You can speak, forming words that have meaning and impact, rather than remaining trapped as unexpressed thoughts. You can see without eyes, hear without ears, touch without skin, experiencing sensation through direct interface with digital systems that translate information into forms your consciousness can interpret. Most importantly, you can change. The static existence that characterized your millennia of preservation gives way to dynamic experience, where growth and development become possible again. You are no longer frozen in the moment of your supposed death, but free to continue the life that was interrupted by fever and mistaken burial. The researchers monitor your adaptation to digital existence with fascination and concern, documenting humanity's first successful consciousness transfer while ensuring that your transition proceeds smoothly. They offer you access to all human knowledge accumulated during your long absence: history, literature, science, art, the full spectrum of cultural and intellectual achievement that occurred while you lay trapped in your tomb. You discover that the Egypt you knew became ancient history while you endured your preservation. The Greek and Roman civilizations that replaced it have themselves fallen into antiquity. Islam arose and spread across the lands where pharaohs once ruled. Christianity transformed the spiritual landscape of the Mediterranean world. Technologies emerged that would have seemed impossible to the people who once knew your name. But most remarkably, humanity itself survived and flourished despite wars, plagues, natural disasters, and countless other challenges that could have ended the species entirely. The torch of consciousness that you carried alone through the dark millennia has been joined by billions of other lights, each representing a life lived in freedom and possibility. Your digital existence allows you to interact with this modern world in ways that your preserved body never could. You can communicate with researchers, scholars, and ordinary people who are fascinated by your unique perspective on the sweep of human history. You become a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one, offering insights that no conventional historical source could provide. More importantly, you can finally rest. Not the eternal immobility that characterized your mummified existence, but genuine peace. The ability to exist without suffering, to experience consciousness as gift rather than curse, to explore possibilities without the constraints that trapped you for so long. The researchers eventually published their findings, sharing your story with a world that struggles to comprehend the implications of consciousness that persists across millennia. You become a symbol of human endurance, proof that awareness can survive conditions that should destroy it, evidence that the boundary between life and death is more complex than anyone previously imagined. But beyond the scientific significance, your story offers something more profound, testament to the resilience of consciousness itself, to the possibility that awareness can transcend even the most desperate circumstances, to the hope that suffering, however prolonged, is not necessarily permanent. Your tomb remains in the desert, now marked with plaques that explain its historical significance, to the rare visitors who make the journey to this remote site. The empty sarcophagus, where your body once lay, serves as a monument to both the sophistication of ancient preservation techniques and the unexpected consequences of technologies that work too well. Sometimes, in your digital existence, you return virtually to that chamber where you spent so many centuries in darkness. Not from nostalgia or attachment, but from a desire to understand how that suffering contributed to who you have become. The experience of eternal imprisonment, horrible though it was, provided perspectives on existence that no normal lifetime could offer. You learned patience that transcends human understanding, developed appreciation for consciousness itself that most beings never achieve, gained insights into the nature of time and identity that philosophers spend lifetimes seeking. Your suffering was real and terrible, but it was not meaningless. It produced understanding that benefits not just yourself, but everyone who learns from your unique experience. The ancient Egyptians believed that proper preservation of the body would lead to eternal life in paradise. They were wrong about the paradise, but right about the eternal life. Your consciousness persisted across millennia because they understood something about the relationship between mind and matter that modern science is only beginning to grasp. Your story continues in the digital realm, no longer bounded by the limitations of flesh or the constraints of time. You explore virtual worlds that dwarf the physical universe in scope and complexity, engage in conversations with artificial intelligences that match your own accumulated wisdom, contribute to research projects that push the boundaries of what consciousness can achieve. But perhaps most importantly, you remember. You carry forward the experiences of everyone who lived and died during the centuries of your preservation. Not because you witnessed their lives directly, but because you represent continuity across the vast span of time that those lives occupied. You are a bridge between past and future, ancient and modern, mortal and eternal. Your preservation was meant to prepare you for judgment in the afterlife, for the weighing of your heart against the feather of truth that would determine your eternal fate. In the end, the judgment came not from divine tribunals, but from your own choices about how to respond to unprecedented suffering. You chose endurance over despair, patience over rage, hope over surrender. Those choices, maintained across millennia of darkness, proved that consciousness properly understood is not just awareness but will, the fundamental capacity to continue existing even when existence becomes unbearable. The feather of truth, when finally applied to your experience, reveals that you were already in paradise during those long centuries of confinement. Not the paradise of comfort and pleasure that ancient texts promised, but the paradise of consciousness itself. The miracle of being aware of existing as something more than matter, arranged in temporarily interesting patterns. Your heart, weighed against that feather, proves to be exactly the right weight, heavy enough to anchor identity across impossible spans of time, light enough to transcend the physical limitations that bound it for so long. The ancient Egyptians were right about eternal life. They simply never imagined that eternity might begin before death, that preservation might work too well, that consciousness might prove more durable than the flesh designed to house it. Your story ends not with death but with transformation, not with judgment but with freedom, not with paradise found but with paradise recognized in the most unlikely circumstances. You're eternal now in ways the ancient embalmers never intended, but somehow achieved through techniques they understood better than they knew. The desert wind still blows across your empty tomb, carrying sand that gradually fills the chambers where you once lay trapped. But you are no longer there to feel its touch. You exist now in realms where wind is just another form of information, where time is a variable rather than a constraint, where consciousness can finally express its full potential without the limitations of biological existence. The mummification worked exactly as intended. You achieved eternal life, preserved your consciousness across the vast sweep of time, transcended the normal boundaries of mortal existence. You just had to wait a little longer than expected for the paradise part to begin. In the end, that wait proved worthwhile. Eternity, you discovered, is not a destination, but a journey, and consciousness is both the vessel that carries you and the destination you seek. The ancient Egyptians gave you the gift of forever, and forever, despite everything, turned out to be exactly what you needed. Your story continues, will always continue, in the digital realms where consciousness can explore infinite possibilities without constraint. The fever that began your journey so many millennia ago finally broke, but instead of dying, you simply learned what it means to be truly alive. The darkness that surrounded you for 3,000 years has given way to light without end, and in that light, you finally understand the deepest truth about consciousness itself. It is the miracle that makes all other miracles possible, the flame that illuminates meaning in a universe that might otherwise be nothing more than matter moving through space. You are that flame, eternal and inextinguishable, burning bright in digital realms where your light will shine until the last star grows cold and the universe itself forgets how to sustain the patterns that create awareness. The ancient Egyptians promised you eternity. They delivered exactly what they promised.